All right, we're live back in our global podcast studios here in Atlanta, Georgia. Rich Casanova on this side of the table, and Mr. Dewayne Hart, the guru, the dude all about cybersecurity. He's written the book on the subject matter. He has a podcast on the subject matter, a YouTube channel, and he's joining us here in the studio. We're going to talk today about our water systems and cracks, hacks, attacks, and we're going to do a case study of some challenges that California's vulnerable water system faces many threats. So, Dewayne, welcome to the podcast.
I'm here again. Always great to be here in Global Podcast Studios having a discussion about cybersecurity. But I think today is very important because normally as humans, we never think about how cybersecurity plays a pivotal role in our infrastructure and our public water system.
Right.
And what I'm finding out as I go through my journey of having discussions with people or various genre of professional individuals that are involved with technology or not involved with technology is that they are surprised by how cybersecurity affects our lives on a daily basis. And I try to, and I think I do a great job of it, of explaining to the audience that cybersecurity is a part of everything that we do, because when you think of IT, you think of cybersecurity. IT is a part of our lives today. So we cannot exclude the cybersecurity from mostly anything that we do in life.
Absolutely. So this is it's a topic we haven't really addressed on the podcast, or I don't believe on the YouTube channel, but you're going to reference a couple of chapters in your book on this subject matter. But normally you think in terms of a cyber attack on a municipality, thank you, is related to the grid in terms of technology, the internet, or the power systems, right? But, water, as we mentioned before we went on the air, from my knowledge, I believe we can only survive about 3 weeks without food, but only 3 days without water. And something we kind of take for granted, especially here in Western civilization and today, a lot of countries around the world, water is a daily, challenge. But let's talk in terms of issues in California specifically, and what we were talking about before we went on the air, the issue of what are a couple of ways that a city water system could be threatened.
All right. Okay. So first of all, I want to take all the listeners through a small roadmap.
Okay.
All right. Here's the roadmap. When you think of cybersecurity, there is always the shield of protection. And that shield of protection states that someone has to infiltrate the bubble. And this is what hackers try to do.
Right.
In order to infiltrate the bubble, then there has to be some type of weaknesses.
Yeah.
Let's say, for instance, you have a legacy system that's not cybersecurity ready, or if you have some vulnerable software programs. Those are direct ways to intrude the system. So when we look at these software programs, sometimes the operating systems, such as Microsoft systems, are vulnerable because they're not patched. So you think of a patch as a software upgrade that will remove a deficiency or try to remove a risk of some sort.
Right.
So what happens is that a lot of companies and organizations are behind the ball curve and doing these software upgrades. And hackers know that.
Right.
So what hackers like to do is to find ways to infiltrate those systems. Over in chapter 19, talking about the hacker's mindset, this is very important because to have the hacker's mindset means that you need to be proactive in trying to reduce these type of incidents.
Right.
And so when you think about being proactive, see, that falls into chapter 13 of the cybersecurity mindset about being, proactive versus like reactive.
Right.
So that's the small picture about what happens. Now, the idea is, what do people do to prevent hackers from infiltrating the bubble?
Right. Yeah. And speaking of attacking the bubble, so you shared an article with me before we went on the air about, and I'll just kind of quote this in a sense of, on February morning, 2021, a water treatment plant in Altamore, Florida, noticed something unusual. An unidentified user had remotely accessed, which you shared with before we went on the air. I was thinking like you'd have to have like an inside job, somebody that was inside the water plant affecting this. But in fact, that remotely accessed attacker basically attacked the plant's computer system and was moving the mouse around the system, which basically expound on that. I mean, what's the repercussions of that, right?
Okay, this is called a remote execution attack.
Okay.
So it means that there are some vulnerabilities in the system or like some type of method where a hacker can remotely cause damage. Let's just imagine we are in the city of Atlanta.
Right.
And looking at a water plant here.
Right.
And there's a hacker maybe out in Vegas somewhere.
Yeah. Right.
Who can gain access to a system and remotely cause an attack to occur. Now, the question arises, how can they do that? What is the technical aspects of how all of this happens? See, this goes back to the first part of the discussion that I was having, was that when you have these software programs that are very vulnerable, and when these software programs do not even have the upgrades that they need, they create an unsecure channel. So if it's an unsecure channel, it's just like your front door is open.
Right.
And so like everyone can come in.
Right.
So that means that you don't need to log in.
Yeah.
There is no authentication. So like you don't need a username and password because these vulnerable software programs provide entry and gateways into your IT enterprise.
Yeah.
So to all my listeners, kind of think of it as an open door policy.
Right.
Is that when you have a vulnerable software program, it's like opening your front door and telling everybody they can come through.
Right. Or just leaving your phone on the table or your computer open and not requiring any password access. And I believe most of the water plants in the U.S., with the exception of some major cities, but they were built, kind of low tech, right? So long as water flowed through the system, you're good to go, right? And the controls were just controlling the valves and the amount of water and, all that good stuff, right?
Well, most of these systems were actually built back in the 70s or the 80s.
Right.
They were not IT-based systems. They were privately enclosed systems. So over the past probably 10 to 15 years, a lot of these systems have became IT-based.
Right.
But the term is called OT-based, which is an operational system, right?
Okay.
Operational technology system. So what happens is that a lot of those systems are still working off of legacy applications.
Right.
A lot of those systems have not matured to that level to become protected. Now the government has taken a lead in helping a lot of these critical infrastructure components come up to standard. Now, I want to make a statement here. When we think of critical infrastructure, those are things like your chemical plants, your communication system, your dams, IT, your food plants, your financial system, and your transportation.
Power plants and so forth, yeah.
Okay, those are the things that is needed to go keep the country operating and moving. So when those are damaged, it could cause a severe disruption. Now back to the discussion is that a lot of these systems are older, and the government has references and guidelines to help the organizations come up to standards, like the Department of Homeland Security has kind of helped out a little bit and given organizations a framework to follow. But the plants have to implement those standards and use those to the best of their ability, because the government is not on site telling the organization, okay, you need to patch this system.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So they give you the guidelines. What's happening is that I still think that it goes back to the concept of the cybersecurity culture. Who is taking this seriously?
Right.
Because as much speech that we have and as much news that is being broadcast, it's still evident that there are still some significant gaps when it comes to understanding how to implement cybersecurity, and also the critical importance of having cybersecurity in place. And I've always liked to say that there is no easy way, but there is a roadmap. And that roadmap is to be proactive and to understand your environment and try to develop those type of defenses that's going to protect that environment. But you have to have that continuous visibility mindset, which means that you're always active, always doing your assessments and trying to discover what your most potential weaknesses are located.
Yeah, and how do you go about, doing that with so many moving parts, and not just like we said, somebody on the inside, but this remote access is what's really kind of scary. And so, I mean, how do you address that? I mean, what kind of protocols do you put in place? Or, I mean, you obviously have the checks and balances. I mean, one thing that's really critical in the water infrastructure is, like I said, I'm not normally an alarmist, and this is kind of like almost a sci-fi kind of, situation. But if there was elements placed into the water that could hurt people, how do you detect that? Hopefully, the water plant would naturally identify certain things, almost like TSA
Right.
security, right?
Right. Well, there's two levels of support. One is the cybersecurity piece, which is to identify that the system has a problem and it's been infiltrated.
Right.
The second level is that there is private software programs that are testing the water level for soda, for like lye or something
Right.
like that, right? And that information should be fed back to your operators. Now to look at these systems in the state, okay, how can you stay ahead?
Right.
Here's kind of my recommendation, because to stay ahead means that there's like 20,000 things that I could discuss. One straight out the door is that organizations have to maintain visibility. Visibility is very important because hacking happens because it's part of the unknown.
Right.
Let's just say, for instance, right, if someone know that a person is going to break into their house, they can stop that from happening. Imagine if we as humans could predict when hacking is going to occur, or if we know that we have vulnerable systems and those vulnerable systems could lead to incidents.
Right.
Well, that means that you should be proactive and trying to remediate those concerns for those systems as well too. Now, when I say that you're trying to remediate those concerns, means that you're going to do the software upgrade. You're going to close an unsecure channel. You're going to block traffic to your network where these unauthorized sources try to infiltrate the system. These are the things that has to happen, because organizations have the tools there, because there are tools that'll tell you that a software program has a weakness or if it has a vulnerability.
Yeah.
It's a vulnerability there. Now, how they manage that process is pretty much entirely different. But I think that what happens is that a lot of organizations are pretty much involved with a high tempo environments where you kind of lapse on cybersecurity, because unless something happens, that's the only time people is going to respond, which kind of takes us back to chapter 13 of the cybersecurity mindset. It's being proactive versus reactive, because reactive means that we are in a place of emergency.
Yeah, you're scrambling, and if you don't, you can't predict and you can't prevent everything, right?
No.
But you need to have those, in terms of being proactive, have those protocols in place. So if worst case scenario does happen, you have a plan of action.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things that are available for a lot of organizations is to do their assessments, because you can have third-party sources to come in and do a cybersecurity assessment, and you can have the Department of Homeland Security to do a cybersecurity assessment of your organization. One of the other ways too is that organization can do a penetration testing.
Yeah, almost like a mock scenario. Of it's been attacked, and then see how people react.
Yes, because through penetration testing, organizations, employees do not even know that it's being carried out, because part of a penetration test is to scan an environment and to find vulnerabilities and to see if you can exploit it. So you can think of penetration testing like the ethical hacker, all right?
Right.
Which is a form of hacking, but it's ethical because they are employed to see if they can carry out the same tactics as these hackers would,
right.
which is an unethical way of infiltrating the system. So you hire companies to do that just to see how weak you are.
Yeah, and where the broken links are at, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember years ago we interviewed a CPA firm, and they were in the business of forensics CPA, right? And they actually hired a person that had been sent to jail that had embezzled from the company, because that person now returning from jail knew all of how a criminal mind thinks. And so basically they had an expert on the inside knowing that. Let's switch gears a little bit, or kind of pivot to, we've been talking about, the typical city water system. In the article you shared with me, there's a lot of content about, dams that are, part of our water infrastructure, right? So here's some interesting stats for you. It says there's estimated about 63% of the nation's 91,000 dams are privately owned. That's a kind of a shocking stat, right? Let me repeat it one more time. At the top of this page on the article, it says 63% of the nation's 91,000 dams are privately owned. So we've been talking about, the federal agencies monitoring this and policing this, if you will, right? And it goes on to say that federal, state, and local governments and utilities own only 35%. The remaining 2%, this is a shocking stat. The remaining 2% have undetermined ownership. How do you monitor 63% of privately owned and 2% undetermined?
Well,
I mean, that just leaves it up to the marketplace.
Right. Here's kind of the way I look at it is that the government now is starting to put some stiff regulations on cybersecurity. It's to hold a lot of corporations responsible. So I think that it has to be really communicated to the private owners,
right,
that you have to abide to cybersecurity. Because I understand that as a private owner, profits are very important.
Right.
But also too, you are affecting human lives. Okay. That is the most important thing to go think about.
Well, if they fail or drop the ball in cybersecurity, much like we talked in previous podcast episodes about retail, right? So if your retail operation, in terms of the money flow, may not be monitored or regulated that heavily by the government, but if there's a cyber attack on your, retail brand, that's going to impact your bottom line, right? Because customers, now you lost the trust in customers, so much like with the dams, the privately owned dams.
Well,
right?
Well, that's where balanced security comes into the surface, because we all understand that businesses are here for profit, but at the same time, we have to understand that human lives are at risk. So what businesses have to do is to practice balanced security, because you're never going to have it where one of those is going to exceed the other one.
Right.
And if it does, then it's going to cause some significant problem. Because if you exceed the human lives, right, to a certain level, well, it's going to cost you more, and then see your profit base go down.
Right.
If you start to increase your profit up and say, I'm just concerned about profit, well, you're going to affect human life. So what you have to do is to balance those two out and try to reduce problems to the lowest level. I know for a fact that there are plenty of guidance and information that's been shared to the public. As I go through the internet, I've seen that there have been conferences held through the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies which try to enforce organizations to follow certain guidelines and regulations. And also, too, the Department of Homeland Security has some guides out for each one of those 16 sectors that are part of the critical infrastructure. So if someone wants to go to their webpage and search, you could find a guide that would tell you the best practices that you can have for those infrastructures. See, that's very important. But the idea is that the organization has to take those policies, regulations, guidelines, and try to use them to their best need or purposes. But I think one of the disconnection too is that you brought up the word private.
Yeah.
And also too, see, that's the word federal.
Right.
When it comes to the art of cybersecurity, what is important for one side may be different from the other side, because the government is a service-based organization where private organizations are a profit-based organization.
Right.
So the cybersecurity approach may be different. This is why I wrote the cybersecurity mindset.
Right. Yeah.
Because I wanted to level the playing field out. It doesn't make a difference whether you're the federal side or whether you're the private side. When it comes to cybersecurity, there are some things that have to be shared amongst everyone. And as I read this article here, and as I've read through some of the verbiage in here, a lot of this would be simple to a lot of cybersecurity people. In fact, it would be simple to regular people too. The listeners out there, when you hear things such as, if you don't patch that system, it's like having an open door. Every genre of person that's listening now is probably saying, why? That's easy. Yeah. That's all they have to do is to patch it. But you know what? Organizations fail that test.
Yep.
Okay. So they fail that test.
Okay. So next up, let's switch gears. Let's talk about this ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline that happened and the president's response to this. But before we jump into that topic, just want to remind your listeners that you're listening to Dewayne Hart. Here we're having him as a guest in our global podcast studios here in Atlanta. He's the author of the Cybersecurity Mindset, which is an operative word. If you've heard him mention that a number of times, it's not cybersecurity, it's having a mindset, right? So it's part of your DNA. He's also the host of the Chief of Cybersecurity podcast. So to check out his book, the podcast, learn more, reach out to the man of the hour, Dewayne Hart. Just go to DewayneHart.com. That's DewayneHart.com for all things cybersecurity. Again, his book, the podcast, YouTube channel, all that good stuff. So we've been talking about water supply, kind of in tandem with this. Actually, following up on the top of the podcast, we mentioned this incident that happened in Florida, the Oldsmore incidents in the city. Indeed, it's not a one-off. A few months later, in fact, a ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline, a vital U.S. conduit between the Gulf of Mexico and the East Coast, spurred not only fuel shortages, but flight cancellation. It's this ripple effect, right? And actually, a state of emergency was declared by President Biden. Here's his response. Biden unveiled a national strategy for cybersecurity that calls for a, quote, more intentional, more coordinated, more well-resourced approach to cyber defense. Your thoughts on this and that it raises to the level of the White House?
Well, but that's a key word, cyber defense.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. I'm going to stay with that word.
Okay.
Because cyber defense is about trying to protect an environment, and it goes back to the shield of protection. When we take a circle and we draw it around all of the 16 sectors, and the outer portion of that circle is red, well, that's cybersecurity. But part of cybersecurity is making sure that those intricate pieces are in place. There are some typical type of technologies like zero trust, some data loss prevention, looking at some of the other things such as isolation, looking at your penetration testing, looking at auditing, looking at your vulnerability management program, any of those that you have in place. And if you operate those well, those are going to make your cybersecurity program become very effective. One of the ways that I've always found out to make cyber defense operate is to just think about an entire environment and look at some of the intricate pieces that you have on the inside of your environment and say, how can we protect that environment? And then, as I said before, cyber defense is very important. Now, I think one of the ways that we can make cyber defense work is to do a case study on the military and looking at the way that military does business.
Yeah, that's a good example, yeah.
Right. Because I think that in corporate America, because it's such a profit-based organization, and I think a lot of times cybersecurity may become lapsed, I think that if it was a coordinated effort where some organizations just sit down and have a conversation, especially with the military area, and try to learn as much about the way that they do business, I think it would operate as well. Okay, yeah. It would operate as well, because there's been a discussion that there's a separation between the way the military work and also that corporate America work. Let me just make it simple. If I take a Windows 10 desktop, and if it tells me that the operations, what if it tells me that the operating system is vulnerable, and it tells me that I need to install these 3 patches, because if I don't, I am going to create an unsecure channel. Now, military environment has that same system. Corporate America company has that same system. That applies to both of them.
Right.
But the difference is, how critical does it mean to one organization versus the other organization? And see, now that's where the cybersecurity mindset comes to place. All right. Because it removes those barriers and say that this is cybersecurity, and we need to react upon it, because it builds a culture where people can embrace cybersecurity and start to see that you have to be proactive, and you have to take some of the practices very simple. Serious.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I like your analogy in reference to the military, because, we have a lot of conversations on our business podcast, platform, and businesses are typically wired, for customer acquisition, marketing, HR issues, profit and loss, all that good stuff, right? They don't necessarily have contingency plans for the topics we're addressing, as opposed to like military. It's part of, again, their DNA. They're wired for strategies and contingencies, right? And another analogy would be good is sports, right? You mentioned the cyber defense. So any good sports team has a balance of defense and offense, right? You can't just be in a defense mode. You're not going to win the game, right? Oh. And in terms of sports, they don't walk onto the field and just let's see how things go, right? They have a playbook in mind, right? And military has a blueprint. That's what's, I think, unique about businesses. Until they're aware, until they have the cybersecurity mindset, that's not really typically top of mind as it should be. Because again, they're focusing on customers, marketing, sales, employees, their real estate and so forth, right? And it's more transactional. Makes sense? Yes or yes?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense, because, one of the ways to look at this entire cyber defense principle is to think holistically about cybersecurity, and knowing that cybersecurity operates at 360 degrees. All right. And at 360 degrees is saying that you have to look at your enterprise and you have to identify those blind spots too. All right. Because blind spots are those things that you overlook, such as a Windows 10 device.
Right.
That is sitting on the desk. Well, it's just a Windows 10 desktop. Yeah. Right.
What harm could that do?
Yeah. What harm can it do?
Right.
Or if you find out that most of the enterprises do not even know how many assets that they have in the enterprise, because an asset can be a server, it can be a printer, it can be a laptop, but sometimes they lose track of those devices.
Right.
So if you lose track of those devices, but they still network on your devices, you're vulnerable. And most of the people that have probably listened to the podcast know that an asset management program in most organizations are dysfunctional. All right.
Right.
So what I've always liked to say is that organizations that work through a defensive mindset think about increasing protection and lowering risk. That is the simplest way I can address how to approach it, because when you think about your protection state, you are you are saying that I am going to try to protect as much as possible, but I'm going to reduce as many risks as possible. And that causes your cybersecurity program to mature. So I like the statement that the president gave there.
Yeah.
Now, the next level is that who wants to take it on board?
Right.
All right.
How much of a priority is that going to be?
Yes. How can we measure progress?
Yeah. Yeah.
See, that's great.
Right.
But like I said before, who wants to take it on board, and how can we measure progress?
Well, and a final kind of thought, we're pretty much out of time at this juncture, but I'll mention something, your response and any closing thoughts or comments. But again, you're listening to Dewayne Hart here on in Atlanta, our Global Podcast Studios. We're talking about water, threats on city water systems and so forth. And we talked about the dams and who owns 68% of those and so forth, but privately held. But a closing comment or thought is, there's a statement here about, they say one of the largest water providers in the country is the Metropolitan Water District from Southern California, a massive regional wholesaler that supplies 26 agencies serving 19 million people, including the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And there was a America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018 addressed a lot of these issues. But here's what's interesting to note is that these water systems serving just more than 3,300 people are required to actively update their risk and resilience assessment and emergency plans every 5 years.
Whoa.
5 years. Exactly. A lot could happen in 5 months. Right?
Yeah.
This is like second to the last page of the article here when it's talking about, again, they set this benchmark of somebody came up with this arbitrary number of if it's serving more than 3,300 people and above, it has to be accessed every 5 years. Well, that can't be. This was a Water Act of 2018. We're now 2023. Hopefully that's been updated at this point.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully it's been updated because most organizations would actually have a cybersecurity assessment on an annual basis.
Yeah, yeah.
And part of that assessment is to test your resilience. Now, I want to break down cyber resilience to the listeners because cyber resilience is saying that through all type of changes that your system can still operate and to stay online. So if you imagine that you have a system, and if you lose power to that system, well, that system should be able to withstand power loss and to maintain availability and to stay online, maybe through backup power or something like that. So when you have a cyber attack, organizations are able to change their system to a nature where they can stay online, where they can operate freely. All right. So like cyber resilience is very important because it's like a piece of rubber band, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. No matter how far I stretch you out, once I let go, you should come back to your natural form. Now, I'm always thinking, if it's a chemical plant, what type of cyber resilience practices are in place? One of the ways I think that it could operate is that organizations need to have a continuous engagement. So which means that no matter what happens with your system, you are actively engaged into operational practices and you understand operations and you can increase your availability where that system stays online. Because that's the portion of the CIA triad, right? Because in this world of cybersecurity, everyone knows about the confidentiality, integrity, and your availability.
Right.
So when you think of cyber resilience, then you're thinking about availability. 99.1% of the time, if you can maintain the operational aspects of your system, well, guess what? Your resilience is up.
Right.
And your protective state is up.
Right.
Risk is down.
Right.
And when that happens, that's when you mature cybersecurity. I always make that statement because that's kind of like the easiest approach
Right.
to really thinking about how you can mature and get cybersecurity to operate.
Yeah.
Without going through 20,000 other diagrams.
It definitely makes sense because it kind of circles back to the illustration analogy of the military and the sports, right?
Yeah.
So the military has drills that they go through on a regular basis, contingency plans and worst case scenario. I mean, you served in the military, you know this in terms of, right, all of the not just protocols, but the systems they have in place. And they're always prepared for the worst case scenario, right? And to the sports analogy, they're on the practice field more than they are on the playing field, right? So back to, businesses, whether it's a water system or whatever business, that has to be in place.
Operational resilience.
Yeah.
And I make this short.
Okay.
For all my friends that are in the Navy, you understand about those fire drills that you have on board a ship.
Yeah.
And all the other drills that you have where you go and you simulate that a ship is flooding and that a ship is sinking, and your man overboard drills that
Right.
you have, somebody don't fell overboard. So how do you react?
Right.
That's part of operational resilience and the redundancy, because on a ship, let's say if your engines fail,
right,
what are your alternatives?
Yeah.
All right. So we practice that a lot in the military. Even
Right.
so, in probably every other branch of the military, like the Army, I guess that when the guys are in their tanks,
Right.
and they are having different type of drills, and let's say, like you lose your equipment,
Right.
or if your gun's
Power
not
failure.
working,
Yeah.
power failure. What is supposed to happen?
Yeah. What's
Now,
your plan B?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
All right.
that's how we operate.
All right, Mr. Hart, that's how we operate here. And so, again, pleasure having you back in the studio. And we look forward to seeing you next time on another episode. So until then, be safe, right? And what are you wearing on top of your head? The hacker's hat.
Thank you.
Absolutely.